Hey everybody, Robert with RC Archery. Indoor season is quickly coming up, and I made a post on my Instagram channel asking what are your questions revolving around indoor season for your bow setup, shooting, equipment, whatever it may be. And a lot of the responses that I got really quickly were about arrows. So I wanted to do my first video and go over arrow setup for indoors, how to choose between carbon and aluminum, what to look at for point weights, and how to get it set up for your bow. So one of the questions that I wanted to touch on first was choosing between aluminum and carbon arrows. And there's some more questions that are going to go along with each, so I'll go over those as well. But I wanted to give you my take on which style of arrow you should use. Personally, I feel like carbon is the way that you should be going with what you're doing for your indoor setup. There's been a lot of aluminum arrows being used over the years, and there's still going to be a lot of aluminum arrows being used each year as well. But if you've noticed, and if you pay attention to trends and what you're seeing as far as numbers and what people are using, carbons have been becoming more and more prominent within the indoor realms. And a lot of that I feel is that the carbon arrows will have more spine differences and ways for you to choose and choices and everything for you. And I think that's a really big factor. That is personally why I choose the carbon arrow, and why I use them is because I can choose a spine dependent on how my bow is set up and how I'm setting up the arrow that will match, and I can adjust that arrow more easily in order to shoot more consistently on paper. Now, aluminum arrows are incredibly popular. They have been for years. And the reason that is because aluminum is a very consistently straight material. So from one arrow to another, you're going to get very little, movements and tolerances and what you're seeing as far as bends or straightness and things of that nature, and spine. All that remains relatively consistent, a little bit easier than carbon. Another thing is the debate between aluminum and carbon as far as speed goes. And a lot of people think that an aluminum arrow is the way to go because they're heavier arrows. You usually have to build them a little heavier because you have to break down the spine of that arrow. And that allows the arrow to have more time to correct itself on the way to the target, and it helps you be more consistent. To the flip side of that is using a carbon arrow. It's lighter, and while not always being incredibly light, it's lighter than an aluminum arrow, and that lightness will allow the arrow to come out of the bow a little bit quicker. It gets down range a little faster, and some people believe that that is more accurate for them as well. Personally, in my findings, I feel like being able to match the spine of the arrow to your bow and get those two to gel together is going to make the biggest difference regardless of speed. But I also feel personally that the arrow leaving the bow a little faster is going to do a few things as far as your forgivability and your groupings and what you're seeing downrange. So to touch on that a little bit more, let's talk about it really fast. The arrow leaving the bow quicker, in my opinion, giving more forgiveness, just meaning that there's less variance in your misses down range when you're not perfect. And that's what I look at as far as forgiveness on the bow. So when I make a mistake, there's a less distance from dead center on my miss. And the reason I think the arrow coming out of the bow faster helps in that is for a couple things. One, if you have any difference or variance in your face pressure on the string, or if you're torquing the bow a little bit on your grip, things of that nature, if you come off a little bit differently with your release hand and change the pressure on the back end of that string, it's going to move the arrow. But if that arrow is leaving the bow faster than, say, a heavier, slower arrow, it's going to have less time to actually be moved as it's going through. The other side of that is that the faster movement coming out of that bow when there is, say, face pressure changes on the string, is that arrow is going to be coming out and it's going to spin itself faster as well. That faster spin coming out of the bow can help correct it a little bit quicker as well. Those two things I find, for me personally, work better for me. I've shot heavy aluminum arrows, even heavier aluminum arrows that were spined correctly for my bow, and then I've shot these carbon arrows that are a little lighter, and I've always scored better with these carbon arrows. And that's, back-to-back changes when I was trying to shoot and figure out which arrows that I was going with. These were coming out ahead for me every time in every test that I did. So that is a big onset of why I believe that the arrow leaving the bow a little bit faster allows for better forgiveness, but you still have to have the arrow spined correctly. It still has to be built well, and you still have to be using a quality arrow. So let's talk about that really quick. So a couple of the really good questions that I got, along with all the others, but regarding just around, how you're setting your arrows up and what you're doing, were point weights and then making the spine of the arrow match your bow. One of them was related to aluminum arrows, and I want to touch on that really fast. And the question on that was, how do you get a 2315 aluminum to work for you when you're a short draw archer? And I have heard some different theories behind this and different things that are used. And one of them is actually one that I've heard from George Riles. And the way that he sets up his arrows for those 2315s is he's saying that it works well across the board for multitudes of draw lengths, short, long, anything in between. And it's using 180 grains, I believe, up front, and then he cuts them to, I want to say 30 or 32 inches. Forgive me for misspeaking, it's probably 30 inches. He talks about this in some of his work, some of his videos that he does on A Thing of Weeks, some of his live feeds that he's done whenever he's doing seminars and stuff like that, and you can find that information out there. Personally, I think it's going to be incredibly hard because you're going to have the want to put a lot of front weight into that arrow or run it extremely long. And when you do that, you can run into some problems. I personally feel like you can get too much front weight in these arrows and it causes them to dip, but it also causes them to flex and leave the bow inconsistently and in weird ways sometimes. And I think you can get some random kicks and some flyers, and I just don't see that as being as consistent long-term as what you could be doing. I would say build the arrow to where you have a good setup of FOC. So set up a point weight on that arrow that's going to get you for indoor somewhere in the 15% range. I mean, 12 to 15 is probably fine. If you want to do a little bit more than that, great. I wouldn't go over 20. I would say below 20% and you'll probably be okay. When it comes to these carbon arrows, it's actually incredibly easy. Now you can see here I'm actually using a Black Eagle arrow. This is a PS26 arrow. I chose this over the PS27. The difference in diameter is very small, and these had a little bit different spine ranges, so for me personally I could get these to work better for me. Now just so you know, my setup, I'm a little bit over 28.5 inches. I'm basically right at 28.5, just a touch over. The bow that I'm running right now is peaking at 57.4 pounds. And I'm holding around 13 pounds holding weight. This bow is not an incredibly speed, burner bow, so it's not breaking the arrow down as much, but these arrows fly incredibly well out of that bow. If you use an archery program as far as software for your arrows, I recommend that. I think you can find an incredibly good starting place, if not as well as a good ending place once you learn how to use that program versus what your bow is wanting as well. Those programs, don't be afraid to get somewhere in the lower, softer end on the green or even the other side of that green, and the same for stiff. Different bows and different setups like different things. I found some bows in the past have to have incredibly soft arrows, some want incredibly stiff arrows. So build something on the stiff end to begin with. You can do that by, a couple different ways. You can leave the arrow the length that it is, and you can have a point weight in here with adjustable point weights. I personally use a top hat point. The top hat points have different weights you can get as just the point itself, but then it has brass inserts that screw in and out of them. That's the way that I set up these arrows originally. I adjusted it and used the point weight to get in the ballpark. And I found a setup on that computer program that I could take a weight in the front to get me from one end to the other end of the spectrum in that green ideal zone, and then just figured out which one worked the best. Now for me personally, with this bow that I'm using right now, it's hitting pretty much in the middle of that green zone, but the bow that I was using before this was a Performx 3D. The Performx 3D for me needed a softer arrow, so either one's gonna actually work. Surprisingly enough, I actually am using the same arrow for both of those bows, and ended up being the best as far as the setup went for both of them, because this one doesn't like as soft of an arrow. Other things that you can do to these arrows to set them up to be able to feel a little bit differently as far as the way that they're tuning and shooting is changing different weights on the back of the arrow as well. If you have more weight on the back of the arrow, it's going to respond a little stiffer. So I'm running a 4-fletch arrow, pretty large 4-fletch. It's not feathers, it's still, you know, the plastic vanes, but a 3-fletch would respond totally different than a 4. I personally feel like a 4-fletched arrow, especially for indoor, is going to get you your best results because it's spinning the arrow faster out of the bow. It's allowing it to correct itself a little bit faster, and I found really good groupings with these 4-fletched. Not to say that the 3-fletch didn't work. I tested them back and forth a lot, and there's not a huge difference in the 4-fletch, but it is better when I'm tracking averages. So for me, that means that I'm going to use it. Another thing, make sure you get a good knock. Knocks are incredibly important in indoor, and I think it's something that a lot of people overlook, and it's because you're shooting a lot higher arrow count than normal for most people, and these knocks wear out. They'll bend, they'll stretch, they'll move. You're getting a lot of energy and force put into them. So make sure that you're changing the knocks regularly, checking them. If you start to get some weird arrow flight, or you're getting some misses on target, or the grouping just isn't the same as always, don't think it's yourself. Change these knocks out first. After a while, depending on the knock that you use, you can kind of track how many shots you can get before you need to start changing them, and you can keep track of it to a degree with that as well. Me personally, I use biter knocks. These are the symmetrical knocks. They make an asymmetrical and a symmetrical. For compound, I use symmetrical. You don't need them to be at different angles, you need them to be the same. We're running knocking points, we're running D-loops, we're using a release versus fingers with you know, a traditional bow or a recurve bow. These are the 19.2 Hunter knocks that are in these Black Eagle PS26, and I use the bushing that goes for the Black Eagle arrows as well. And this is what I'm personally using on this setup for me. All right, so there's a couple things that I want to touch on before the end of this video. One of them is tuning. And there's two different ways to look at this depending on your setup and what you're doing. If you're using an arrow that's going to spine correctly for the bow and you have it set up that way, I tune everything exactly the same as I do anything else. And the first part of that for me is actually using the arrow as a bare shaft arrow and shooting it through paper from 6 feet away. And what I'm doing with this is not so much looking for a perfect bullet hole at this point, is just getting all my arrows to tear the exact same way. And what I do initially is set everything up down the center of the bow. My arrow rests in the center, you know, looking at it from limb bolts or looking at it from the center of the riser or however it needs to go, the center of the limbs. And then the cams, I usually just leave them stock, or if I get an incredibly big tear, because sometimes with me, with my natural grip, I'll get right tears, and I know that ahead of time, so it just depends on the setup. But initially what I'm looking for is the smallest tear in paper by rotating the arrow, by rotating the knocks and turning the arrow. And then once I find that, I'm doing that with all my arrows to bring the same tear in. So let's say, for instance, with these arrows, when I first started setting it up before I really tuned the bow, I was shooting them through there and getting a slightly high right tear out of every single arrow that I shot through there, and then adjusting the knock. So some of them were a little bit more right, some of them actually were left. So I would adjust the knock and spin it and turn it, and I actually mark all my arrows here to where I can keep everything consistent. And then on these arrows, I use the biter name. So I just have a way, or the knocks rather, just so I know which way is up. Turn them a little bit, shoot it through paper, turn it, shoot it through paper until all the tears are consistently the same. It does two things. One, it allows me to know that all my arrows are flexing the exact same way out of the bow. It's going to really help with forgiveness and really help with group consistency. The other thing it does is allow me to know if one of these arrows just isn't working. And that may be because maybe one of the ends wasn't squared off, maybe a component is faulty, something needs to change, I did something wrong when I was building them, or it could just be the arrow is off. And that allows me to know if I need to ditch one of the arrows, or if it's still going to be close, or what to expect from it and mark it so that I know later on in case it starts causing me problems. From then, I'll fletch them, do everything like normal, shoot them through paper again, and then really just start working on my tune with the bow. And I don't always need a bullet hole, and honestly I don't always start with a bullet hole. I usually try to get pretty close. But if I can't get an exact bullet hole, that's okay. I go to French tuning, which is basically shooting this arrow at a short distance and a long distance. It's like walk back tuning, but you cut out the middle distance. I'll adjust the bow that way, and then I group tune. The group tuning is the step that I would more rely on, especially if my arrow isn't spined correctly to the bow. And the reason for that is because at the end of the day, we're looking for our best groups on target. And if I can shoot this arrow and move the rest a little bit left, right, up and down, or turn the arrow a little bit if I need to, or whatever it may be, and allow me to get consistent groups, that's what's going to help me the most. So that's the way that I really go about tuning these arrows and looking at them and what I'm doing with them in order to try to get the highest scores that I can get, best X count, whatever it may be. That's what I'm doing with these. But I hope this video helps some of you as far as setting up your arrows and what you're looking for. I'll put some software programs down in the description below on this video so that you have an idea of what I use and where to find it. And I put a description, or a link rather, for these arrows and the components that I use so you can see exactly what I'm using on my setup. Appreciate everybody watching today. Hope you have a good indoor season. I'll have some more of these videos coming out to go over hold on target, shooting, timing, mental focus, all that good stuff, and give you some topics to look over for our upcoming indoor season. Thank you again. I'll see you soon.